Hello, our viewers. This is Gadi Sarabadori show on the OMN. We have two guests today, Mr. Rene Lefort from Paris and Mr. Getachew Reda from Mekelle. We will discuss about current affairs in Ethiopia. Briefly, I would introduce my guests. Mr. Rene Lefort, a long-time observer and commentator on Ethiopian affairs. Rene has also been writing about sub-Saharan Africa since the 1970s and has reported on the region for influential French media like Le Monde Diplomatique, and Liberation and other media. Mr. Getachew Reda is a former Ethiopian government minister, and now he is a member of TPLF's executive committee. Thank you, both of you, for coming on the show, and very welcome to you all.
My pleasure.
Thank you. We start our discussion on current affairs in Ethiopia. We will try to analyze the shifting political landscape in the country, and particularly we will also try to talk about the position of TPLF in this shifting political landscape. That's why we are having Mr. Getachew to have the perspective of the party. Again, I would like to say thank you, both of you. Mr. Rene, if I may start the discussion with you. How do you analyze the shifting political landscape in the country?
Can I ask you a question? Can you give me one concrete, meaningful example of the progress made during the last months to improve the democratic situation of Ethiopia?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Which ones?
I mean, what's your perspective on the? You have written recently that the political landscape of the country is shifting somehow. And what do you mean that? And how do you substantiate your point?
No. What I wrote and what I think is that the U-turn regarding the transition democracy occurred at the end of 17 and beginning of 18. Mm-hmm. Since then, in my view, at least, no progress has been made in the democratic transition, mm-hmm. and even the opposite.
Okay. Do you agree with him, Mr. Getachew Reda, that since the 1970s and the 80s, Ethiopia remains to be stuck in a sort of stagnant position to this date?
Well, I beg to differ. Mm-hmm. In the sense that at least after the 1991 change of government, not just the change of government, but also change of system, mm-hmm. at least there has been a marked shift towards recognizing the diversity of the country, demographic, national, linguistic, and whatnot. Mm-hmm. And of course, the political dispensation that followed the demise of the Derg had to take into account its diversity. And the only way you could accommodate that diversity was through erecting a system that could fully accommodate. And of course, that system had to be both federal and democratic. Although the experience was not as stellar in terms of its performance as we all hoped it would be, at least there was a fundamental shift. Was dealt a blow, and of course, that fundamental shift ushered in a new political dispensation where diversity became, this diversity, linguistic, demographic, or national diversity was fully recognized, and there was a clear understanding that such a diversity cannot be just taken for granted or wished away. Was a fundamental shift in our politics, but that is as far as I'm concerned.
Mr. Rene, if you can hear me again, you have written that the political landscape of the country is shifting. Particularly, I'm referring to this era of the quote-unquote reform. Where do you place TPLF, a party that was championing the actually the disempowerment of Derg before 30 years? Where do you locate TPLF today?
Today?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. First of all, I think that there was a misunderstanding. When I said that the democratic transition, in my view, has stopped in the 17 on 18, it was 2017 and 2018, the 2 years ago, during the famous meetings of the Central Committee of the TPLF and then of the EPRDF. Okay, where is the EPRDF, the TPLF now? Mm-hmm. First, when Meles died, okay, I was absolutely sure that nobody could manage the system it had built, because Meles had built a ruling system by himself and for himself. So nobody could take the same place and manage the same system. It's the reason why I believed at that time that we entered in a transition and that Hailemariam Desalegn could not be sustainable and a prime minister. Okay? Mm-hmm. Then different events came, which are very important. In 2015, if I am right, members of the old guard of the TPLF decided to make a tour in Tigray to know what the people were thinking about the TPLF, okay? And they were absolutely afraid of what they discovered. At that time, the TPLF started a in-depth autocritic. And this autocritic culminated in November, December 2017 during this famous Central Committee, during which, from my knowledge, the TPLF had never made such hard autocritic since 1991. And the TPLF expected that the other parties, OPDO at that time, ANDM, etc., will do the same job. And this was the key moment when the decision was taken to effectively democratize Ethiopia or not democratize Ethiopia. Okay? And in my view, the ADP or ODP, ANDM and OPDO didn't make the same autocritic, and now from this point starts the rise of Abiy. So, who is the TPLF now? I believe that the TPLF has been, I don't know if it's still the case, but the TPLF has been the only political party where, as a group, or at least in the leadership, a real political capacity existed. If this political capacity to analyze and to define a strategy still exists or not, I am not sure. I believe that the fact that people of the old guard, like which were sidelined in 2001, are now much more involved in the TPLF affairs. This could help the TPLF to again becoming a leading political organization. I insist on the political organization. Mm-hmm. Now, the TPLF the Tigray is a de facto state. De facto state is not a sustainable solution. Okay? It could be only a transition. What will happen between the Tigray, TPLF, the federal government, the Amhara region? TPLF has proposed national-wide public dialogue. Will Abiy respond or not? I don't know.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Rene. Mr. Getachew, if you have heard the analysis that Rene given, you can have your own reflection on that. But at the same time, where do you locate the TPLF in this process, that process called reform that has been going for the last 2 years?
Look, I think, I had difficulty following honest analysis because of network problems, I guess, but I can build on what he has been writing on this issue for quite some time now. As far as TPLF's role in this whole reform process goes, I think it would be fair to say that if it wasn't for the decision by the TPLF itself to push for sort of an in-depth reform in 2017, the rest of the organizations, I would say, had hardly any clue whatsoever how to go forward with the kind of reform that ultimately resulted in the change of guards from Haile Mariam Desalegn to Abiy Ahmed. I know there have been all kinds of popular movements in Oromia, mostly in Oromia, and they have had their own significant impact, of course, but at least for the TPLF, it was clear that without reforming the party and the way it does business, the kind of problem that was accumulating in the country was obviously had obviously reached a very untenable stage. Of course, it took us about 40 days to really come up with a clear idea of how to go forward. Of course, this was the very idea of reform that ultimately was pushed as an agenda within the EPRDF Executive Committee. Although there was on the part of OPDO and ACM, and of course the southern SPDM was also to a certain extent reluctant, but it took so much cajoling, so much, including of course what would to fist fighting, to get EPRDF member parties to agree to a reform agenda. But look, the TPLF was genuinely interested in changing the way EPRDF had been managing its affairs, because it was obvious for all of us that the status quo was not tenable anymore. But whether that reform idea was taken seriously by the people who took the mantle of power, for example, OPDO, was an entirely different matter, because the very approach that was followed by Abiy and his comrades in Amhara region was not meant to capitalize on the idea of reform that was brought forth by, but to take advantage of whatever reform ideas were pushed by TPLF to first demonize TPLF itself, and of course then use whatever opportunity to put up themselves in the corridors of power, to in fact renege on the very promises that were made by the EPRDF Executive Committee. The TPLF was for reform and has been for reform, and we were hoping and expecting that Abiy Ahmed and his government would really take the very ideas of reform by the EPRDF Executive Committee seriously. But for Abiy and company, the most important concern was not pushing the EPRDF's agenda of reform, which basically is pretty much what was being propagated in the media starting from November 2017 through to March, April, May 2018. Well, unfortunately, Abiy and company were more interested in a number of checklists they had to take care of, which were not necessarily necessarily intended to placate the people of Ethiopia, but mostly intended to placate whoever was giving them support from the West. Their Western handlers were the ones who were calling the shots. But it was very unfortunate that the very Jews in Oromia who brought about the change of guards were soon to be frustrated, because their concerns, the very concerns that led to the overall reform idea was not taken into account in Abiy and company's first formative year of so-called reform. Most of the reforms that were ostensibly pushed by Abiy and company were mostly intended to placate their handlers than in addressing the great issues that brought use of Oromia, the use of Amhara, the use of the entire country, including Tigray, to express their grievances in public. So TPLF realized from the get-go that the status quo, like you said, especially 2 years after the days of Meles, it was obvious that it was not really exercising the measure of control it once had over political affairs in the country. And the lack of political control also led to security breakdown. And the only way we could break the impasse was by introducing an all-encompassing and comprehensive reform, which was pretty much, I would say, authored by TPLF, and which was at least obviously accepted by the other parties, the other members of the EPADEF. But unfortunately, most of them, including, were only paying lip service to the reform agenda, because what transpired after that makes abundantly clear that what they were more interested in was grabbing power. They were more interested in the trappings of power than what can be done with power itself. So rather than using whatever opportunities they have at their disposal to address the questions and the grievances of the Oromo, the grievances of the Amharas, the grievances of the youth throughout the country, they, especially Abiy, used the opportunity to, first and foremost, demonize and corner TPLF as the culprit for everything that has gone wrong in the country, and second, to solidify his power without any regard whatsoever to what the people who were expecting highly of his leadership. And I mean, he didn't give a hoot what the expectations of people were. He was more interested in solidifying power. But unfortunately, the country descended further and further down into chaos. And Ethiopia, within a year, has now reached the point where it is now one of the countries with the largest number of internally displaced people from the country.
Thank you, Mr. Getachew. Thank you for that analysis of the reform process. Mr. Rene, if I may come back to you, I hope you have heard the perspective of Mr. Getachew on the whole reform process and where we are now. But I would, you can reflect on that at the same time, but I would like to pose you one additional question that I understood from some of your writings. The TPLF, we are trying to locate the TPLF in this reform process. You have written in one of your piece that whether ethnic federalists or opposed to ethnic federalists, quote unquote, there is little political capital to be earned in today's Ethiopia by allying with the TPLF, you said. But Mr. Getachew argues that the reform process, the train of the reform process went out of its way, not because of the TPLF, and there is no point to blame the TPLF. What's your point on that?
No, I agree with Getachew, Reda. I agree on this point. I agree with him that the dynamic for the reform process came from the TPLF for mainly internal reasons in Tigray, because the TPLF has lost before and after the years after Meles' death, the TPLF had lost its popular support. Sebatnega was not even able to take the floor in Adwa because people refused to listen to him. So the TPLF has always been pragmatic. And then the TPLF realized that things should change. And then the TPLF pushed itself and the EPADF for reforms. Unfortunately, I agree also on this point with Getachew Reda. Unfortunately, the other parties didn't push with the same strength for reform, democratic reform, even on the opposite. Now, you know, the TPLF is, I would say, on the same federalist position that I would say, for example, Oromo Federalist Congress or Oromo Liberation Front. They want a true, real federal system. The problem is that for a lot of other federalist forces, the TPLF is not credible. The TPLF is not credible. One of the historical leaders of the TPLF told me once, we have emasculated the ethnic federalism. Okay? So I believe that as long as the TPLF will not clearly, publicly, openly, solemnly admit, not on assess not only its successes, because it has done, it can be proud of a lot of successes, but admits its mistakes, and in particular its mistakes in the field of ethnic federalism, then the TPLF should do that to gain against the confidence of other federalist forces and create a real federalist opposition. That's not the case until now.
Thank you. Okay. Mr. Getachew, I think if we put things into perspective, the argument of Mr. Rene is that because TPLF did waste time over the last 27 years, particularly in democratizing the state, that it's now a burden on it to have a credibility to ally with the democratic and federalist forces. I think that's the nut of his point. What's your reflection to this?
Look, one of the things I can generally and safely say is that TPLF, as part of the EPRDF coalition, was responsible for many of the weaknesses that the EPRDF government had shown over the years. TPLF, as probably one of the most cohesive, one of the most well-organized members of the EPRDF, would probably have should probably have had a much more pronounced role in addressing many of the weaknesses that the EPRDF government, like I said, had shown over the years. But to blame TPLF for everything that has gone wrong in the country is absolutely unfair, because Oromia was, OPDO was in charge of Oromia, ANDM was in charge of Amhara. To the extent that TPLF had a role to play, it was something it should have pushed as part of, as a strong member of the EPRDF coalition. So to that extent, we came out in 2017 and said, we are to blame for everything, not just TPLF, but like I said, TPLF takes its fair share of the blame. And there is no denying that TPLF has had its share of the blame in whatever has transpired as a result of our weaknesses. Now, what I can say at this point is the fact that the four major regions were under EPRDF simply meant that whatever opportunity there was for true federalism to be exercised was almost lost, because the unity of at least the ostensibly were acting in unison, were ostensibly acting on more or less the same policies, and most of the decisions that were made by the EPRDF Executive Committee were taken by the regions lock, stock, and barrel. That, in hindsight, appears to have stood in the way of exercise of true federalism, in the sense that regions which should otherwise have had their own distinct choices of policy because of demographic uniqueness, because of national priorities and whatnot, were not in a position to take advantage of such an opportunity. So to the extent that real federalism was not exercised, I can, in hindsight, say the unity, the sort of uniformity of policies that were being pushed by the Republic Executive Committee from Addis Ababa had partly to blame. But to blame TPLF for everything that has gone wrong, it is going to be absolutely ridiculous, because people like Lama Magarsa, people like Warkana Gabayo, people like Abiy Ahmed were in charge of Oromia. And for Abiy, for example, blame me for not exercising the full measure of self-government right of Oromia, by virtue of the fact that I'm a TPLF committee member, is going to be absolutely ridiculous. Having said that, it is still questionable whether the issue of lack of exercise of a genuine federalism is what propelled the kind of movement that was led by Lama and Abiy that ultimately ended up taking the mantle of power in Arab. As it turned out, Lama first in collusion with Demek and his group in Amhara, were trying to do was first and foremost to gobble up every vestige of power that they assumed were meant to solidify their position, rather than addressing the very problems that we have at fight. The exercise of true federalism, they were more interested in centralizing power in Arab, centralizing power to the exclusion, of course, of the PLF, but this time around, it's not even centralizing power within the party, it's centralizing power with an individual. Even Lama himself Lama, who was one of the architects, now finds himself in the sidelines simply because he proved too inconvenient for the kind of absolute exercise of power, absolute centralization of power. Abiy was absolutely up. So, yes, EPRDF wasted opportunity, although EPRDF made a fundamental achievement that we all should be proud of, like you say, in terms of economic growth, in terms of even political experimentation, federal arrangement, etc. But more should have and could have been done if, in fact, the APR was willing to exercise a measure of diversity within its executive.
But there is this substantive point that, including Rene was writing about, that TPLF has been a bicephalic or two-headed political entity in a way. Over the last 27 years, it was criticizing self-determination right of the Sidama, for example.
Now, I would like to say that on some points I agree with Getachew Reda, on some points I disagree with him. Now, first, I have many difficulties to listen to him because the sound is very bad. Okay, so he said it's ridiculous to put all the blames to the TPLF. I agree 100% with him. That's completely ridiculous. And during the EPRDF time, Ethiopia has made great achievements, in particular in the economical field. You should also give credit to the TPLF to have introduced this federal system, okay, and to have tried to solve this age-old question of nationalities. But when just now Getachew Reda said OPDO was in charge of Oromia, INDM was in charge of the Amhara region, this was on the paper only. This was on the paper only because, in fact, the weight of the TPLF in the EPRDF was so strong that, in fact, the TPLF gave the lead. Okay, and this explains why in Oromia or in the Amhara region, young people revolted, and their rallying cry was "Down Woyane." Okay, so I repeat, when one of the historical leaders of the TPLF told me, we have emasculated the ethnic federalism. I agree with him. The system as ethnic federalism could be promising, but in fact, it has been biased during the last 27 years. And this is the reason why Ethiopia is now in such hard troubles.
Thank you, Mr. Rene. Do you hear me, Mr. Getachew?
Yes, I think I did.
I'm gonna pause you. I'm gonna pause your question.
That TPLF was, as political scientists would call, a primus inter pares, the prime among equals. It had mostly to do with the fact that it was more organized and it had more experience. And especially when Meles was around, Meles came up with all sorts of policy papers. And that's by virtue of the fact that he was more or less the sole fountainhead of the policy choices of EPRDF, simply meant that he had an oversized role within EPRDF. That was clear. I would not, however, say that the fact that Meles had an outside role within EPRDF had to do with the fact that he was head of the TPLF. For example, Abbay Woldu didn't have an outside role in EPRDF because Abbay Woldu didn't come up with policy papers as much as Meles did. So to attribute the role of TPLF within EPRDF to the fact, to the mere fact of its being TPLF would miss the point. Having said that, though, I think there has been marked difference. I mean, for example, TPLF leaders, including Debretsion, who has been active for quite some time now, wouldn't probably blame others for the kind of failures that Tigray has experienced. For example, I mean, to the extent that we have failures in bringing about the kind of or delivering on the promises that we have made to our people. It's not that we're not going to blame others for our own failures, but it is strange now to see the Mekamekonnen, who's been around, for example, for 30 years now, as a big wig of the PRDF, still blames TPLF for everything that's going on in Amhara. You are being too apologetic in favor of people who should have done their assignment in the first place, who should have done their homework in the first place. It's not like TPLF leaders were forcing them at gun's point to make choices they would not otherwise have taken.
Okay,
so
Mr. Getachew.
That they were reluctant to come up with ideas. It's either because they didn't have ideas, or because out of their depths they didn't know what to do with whatever power they have.
Okay, Mr. Getachew, right on this point.
One second.
All right, Mr. Rene.
Getachew, I believe that by saying that and insisting on this point, you confirm exactly what I said before, which is that the TPLF must make a real assessment of its failures and its responsibilities, okay? And when you said Meles, okay, was a Greek leader because he was the only one to publish policy papers, very important and very articulated, etc., etc. I agree with you. I agree that it was normal that Meles, taking into account his capacities, had an editorial, intellectual leadership role to play. That's sure. But I repeat, let me give you only one example. In 2010, OPDO has its Congress. OPDO was willing to elect Abadullah again as chairman of OPDO. The day before the election, Meles gathered different OPDO leaders and told them, you must not elect Abadullah. The next day, Abdullah was not elected. Another guy was elected, which who disappeared a couple of months later. Okay, and more than that, the people of BDO who were strong supporters of Abdullah during the Congress were arrested at the gate of the Congress by the security services. Okay, so in fact, people like Temeke Mekonnen or Abiy Ahmed or Leman Begersa, okay, they could have tried to emancipate from the TPLF, but in fact, the pressures they got and the harassment, in fact, they got prevented them largely to do that.
Okay, Mr. Getachew, you will reflect to Mr. Rene's point, but before that, I would say, in fact, many people would say that TPLF has been a bicephalic party. It had two heads. It would act like a unionist party when it comes to the center, and then oppose, for example, Sidama's self-determination, even including by crushing by force. And now when its influence starts to diminish at Arat Kilo, that it has to limit it to at Mekelle, now it starts supporting the Sidama self-determination. In a way, it was playing two cards, two heads, bicephalic party. Is that not true, honestly?
No, look, let me first address your question and then reflect on what Rene has said. In this particular case of the Sidama, as far as I know, it was not a question of antagonizing Sidama's quest for statehood. In fact, you can ask people like Getachew, Shifarao, and of course, including Haile Mariam Desalegn, who were summoned by Meles Zenawi when the Sidama leadership was making life difficult for Haile Mariam Desalegn, who, as a Walaita, was not necessarily readily accepted by the likes of Shifarao. And the only question they were asked was, what exactly statehood would bring to their people? And Meles didn't tell that statehood was out of reach for the Sidamas, because it would be foolhardy for Meles to argue that way.
I mean, is that right to ask even? Is that right even to ask what would statehood benefit them?
Yeah.
This question should not be raised by Meles, but should be raised by the whole issue of they have to decide if they are able or not to get a state.
Look, he just asked them, because they had when they had conflicts within the higher leadership, the highest leadership within the southern region, when Haile Mariam and Shifarao had a fallout, Meles as the chairperson of the EPRDF had to summon them. And of course, the only question they were asking, well, I got this from Getachew. I wasn't privy to the discussion. This was what Getachew intimated to us. And they were embarrassed because they didn't have any idea. It was an elitist question in the first place. Now, at this point, it has become a popular question. It was. So it's one thing to stand against Sidama's statehood, but it's entirely different to ask the Sidama elite simple question of whether it is going to be the best interest of their people to go for statehood. One, as TPLF, like I said, Meles was the head of EPRDF and he was the prime minister. So as the head of the government, he would have issues to raise. But as far as TPLF goes, self-determination is not something that could be relegated to the back burner simply because it appears to be inconvenient. It has always been our position. It will continue to be our position. And of course, as long as the Sidamas, as long as the Walaitas have popular demands for statehood, I don't think no one can stand in the way of that statehood. To the extent that there were issues in the past, I would tell you, this blanket denial of statehood to the Walaitas or to the Sidamas, if it indeed happened, I would say was unacceptable and is unacceptable. But as far as I know, at least the information I have is that the question that was asked of the Sirama elites was whether statehood was in the best interest of their people. But they couldn't come up with an answer. Now that it has become a popular request, a popular demand, I don't think no one should stop the Siramas or anyone, any people for that matter, to become an independent state of their own. Now, having said that, I'm not privy to the kind of specific details that Rene seems to be on the know regard to Abadullah's election as chairperson. I know for a fact Abadullah was being investigated for graft, for corruption and all that.
Yeah, but almost all leaders could be had corruption problems. Abadullah perhaps a little more than others, but almost all of them had corruption problems.
I don't know the specifics, honestly. I probably was an ordinary member of TPLF when he had it. But one thing I will tell you is, if Abadullah, I think it was Alamayo Atomsa who was elected as chairperson of Opidio. Well, Alamayo was as much popular, if not more popular than Abadullah as far as I can remember. But the whole point is, the very fact that EPRF member parties had the kind of collective leadership that made it possible for one party executive to pry their nose into other parties' decisions simply meant some of the decisions which should probably have been taken by the parties themselves were mostly inviting and unwelcome participants in the decision-making process. It probably was unfortunate, but I wouldn't say this was something that stood in the way of the kind of independence OPDO leaders should have exercised. I mean, even after Meles' departure, who are they going to blame? Haile Mariam Desalegn for prying his nose into their affairs? I mean, please, Rene, we are trying to exculpate people from wrongdoing when in fact they should have assumed full responsibility for the kinds of choices they have made or they have failed to make as leaders of Oromia. But, wasn't there the individual involvement, necessary interference in Oromia's affairs, in Amara's affairs? I cannot say so. Even TPLF has, in its 40-day gum, it has clearly revealed that there were individuals who were making unnecessary interferences in the affairs of sister parties. That much was clear. But to say that TPLF was doing this in an organized fashion, in a manner that emasculated, as it were, OPDO members, that is absolutely ridiculous.
All right, Mr. Getachew. Mr. Rene, in one of your latest articles, you said that the pandemic does present a political opportunity to the current government. How does that make it an opportunity that the pandemic is going to be a golden opportunity for the government now?
Because for a very simple reason. In front of the pandemic, only the ruling power can deliver through its administration. It is the only one, okay? If people need something, the only help they can get will come from the administration, and the administration where in places where the PP is effective, and the administration works under the orders of the PP. Okay? That's the first one. The second point is that the main tool of the opposition was before demonstration, road blockades, etc., etc., etc. And now, today, the opposition cannot use this tool because the pandemic is there. Look what happened after the decision of this constitutional court regarding the solution to the constitutional crisis. OLF, OSC, etc., published a communique, okay, condemning, etc., etc., etc. Not. what can they do more today than publish a communique? So it means, in fact, the political life is frozen particularly for the opposition, and this gives to Abiy Ahmed literally a highway to assess more and more PP's power.
Okay. In one of your tweets, you were taken by surprise that when you heard the House of Federation approved CCI's recommendation to extend both houses and also the regional state councils. You were actually taken by surprise, but a year ago, on an article you wrote almost a year ago, in August 2019, you precisely speculated that Abiy Ahmed is going to extend his term.
Yeah,
how does that play out?
I am sorry, but I don't understand why the readers didn't understand that this tweet was totally ironic. Of course, I was not surprised. I expected that, and the tweet was purely ironic.
Okay. Okay. Otherwise, in your article that you wrote almost a year ago, you precisely predicted that Abiy Ahmed is going to extend his term, and so on and so on, without even assuming that this pandemic is going to play out its own role. That just was running in my head. Thank you again, Mr. Getachew. We are coming to the latter part of our discussion. Let's talk about GERD now. GERD, the Great Ethiopian Renaissance Dam. There is a lot of controversies and all these things, but in this all mess, TPLF is being portrayed as a political entity that is acting against this project, while we know that actually it was Meles Zenawi who masterminded this very project. How was it that we ended up actually TPLF being projected in that sort of image?
Well, I know Abiy Ahmed and his cabal are capable of all kinds of absurdities, including blaming of parties left and right for things they should have been thanked, or they should have been acknowledged for. To the extent that TPLF had a central role in Ethiopia for the previous 27 years, obviously the Great Ethiopian Renaissance Dam was its obsession. More importantly, it was Meles' obsession. And if TPLF was indeed interested in giving the primacy of interest to Tigray, I don't think it would have wasted its time building a dam in Benishangul, the Kudus region. And obviously, it was one of the most monumental mega projects that was Meles as a leader and TPLF as a party had long touted. And Abiy, from the get-go, was absolutely against the dam, because for him the dam was meant for simple political consumption. And in fact, he was believing in its importance. He was making all the kinds of excuses for why not to go ahead with the construction of the dam and all that. Now, it was Abiy who went to Egypt and promised in Arabic, which he didn't understand, because he didn't have to understand. He was making all sorts of promises left and right. Whenever he goes, he makes promises, even if he doesn't understand the language in which he makes those promises. And then it is even more absurd, even by Abiy's standards, to come back again and blame TPLF and for stronger with Meles Zenawi for standing against the building of the dam. Okay. It's absolutely preposterous. TPLF is for the building of the dam, but Abiy and company have already compromised on the sovereignty of the country. They have allowed themselves to be bullied by the Americans. They have allowed the country interested to be second guessed by the Egyptians. No, it is not for Abiy to salvage the great Ethiopian Renaissance Dam. It's for the people of Ethiopia. Abiy has already absconded on his responsibility as far as the great Ethiopian Renaissance Dam is concerned. It adds insult to injury when the Prime Minister and his cabal blame part left and right, including Egypt, for something against the building of it.
All right, thank you, Mr. Getachew. Mr. Rene, I know you have also been very closely following this GERD, Great Ethiopian Dam, perhaps since its commencement. I want you to give us an objective assessment of how TPLF is now being projected vis-a-vis the dam, and also how Abiy's government is doing on it.
No, I am not aware of a specific position of the TPLF regarding the dam. I am not really informed about this.
We are for the dam. TPLF is for the dam.
I personally, I don't work on this specific issue.
All right.
Now, how Abiy is dealing with them?
Yeah.
I think that Abiy has no choice. Abiy cannot go one step back, because if he goes one step back, it will be a political suicide for him. The support for the dam is so strong, so wide in Ethiopia, so deep, that Abiy must stand firm in his positions, otherwise he will lose politically a lot. Okay? Now, I don't understand exactly what has been concluded during this Africa Union meeting, because I don't understand if in 2 weeks, if no agreement is reached, Ethiopia has a right to start the filling or not. That's, for me, from what I read, that's not clear.
Try telling this to the Egyptians, try telling this to the Sudanese. They will tell you he has already agreed. He didn't have his ministers by his side. He didn't have his advisors by his side. He probably didn't have any clue what they were talking about. And he had already said yes to the arrangement the Egyptians were trying to shove down our throats, and he willingly accepted it. Whether or not 2 weeks down the road we'll be in a position to fill the dam is not a matter that should be left to Abiy. It is a matter that should be taken care of by the people of Ethiopia. No more, no less. Because Abiy has already made it clear time and again that he's not particularly interested in protecting the national interest of Ethiopia. It has been abundantly clear that the Great Ethiopian Renaissance Dam is an inconvenience to be dealt with, not a national treasure, a national project to be upheld by people like Abiy. And to expect Abiy, like you said, it's going to be a political suicide. But for people like Abiy, what counts is not strategic considerations that would bear fruit, say in 10 years or something. It is a matter of whether you can stem the tide for a week, whether you can create dramas that would distract people's attention from bread and butter issues, from critical national security issues, even for a single day or.
Okay, Mr. Getachew. Thank you, Mr. Getachew. Before we wind up this discussion, Mr. Rene, I would like you to give us your own assessment on this. The federal government, as you have written, has extended its term of limit, including the states, but the TPLF votes to conduct its own election. So we have a tension between the TPLF and the central government, and what is going to be the end result, and how would this transpire at the end of the day?
Well,
I am not a lawyer, okay? So I cannot say very seriously and based on judiciary analysis if Tigray has or has not the right to organize the elections. Okay, that's not clear for me. Okay, well, Tigray has decided to do so because TPLF needs to have a confirmation of its legitimacy in Tigray, and that can be done only through election. But Tigray is a de facto state. Okay, the main question now is the views of the TPLF and of the PP are totally different on two key issues. One is the kind of federalism to implement, the other is the kind of development to implement and the role of the state in this kind of development. Okay, the best thing which could happen between Tigray and Addis Ababa and Baghdad is to find a modus vivendi. I will not harm you, you will not harm me. And the global elections will decide. The global elections will decide if the Ethiopian people, which kind of federalism the Ethiopian people prefers. But the question is, when will the election be held? When? That at the discretion of Abiy. That's the problem. And until the elections, the opposition will remain completely powerless. TPLF has proposed a national-wide public dialogue. I bet that Abiy will not respond positively because Abiy believes that he is strong enough to rule with the PP and no more, no less.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Rene. Finally, Mr. Getachew, you will reflect briefly on Rene's point, but one thing that I would like to pause for you is that you said earlier at the beginning of our discussion that it was the question of the youth, the question of the young people, the unemployed young people, that actually fueled this reform, and that ended up actually bringing Abiy Ahmed to the power. That's true, which I also believe. But you were also demonizing this youth who were protesting in those days, saying that these are the demons. Would you apologize, given seen in hindsight? Do you think you were wrong saying like that to the protesters today?
Girma, I have been saying this several times over. Mm-hmm. I have never referred to the youth as demons. In fact, I was the only government official who was openly supporting the youth movement as having legitimate reasons in the first place. But I unfortunately used an English expression which was lost in translation, and people mistook it for insulting the Oromo youth as demons. I didn't. But to the extent that people felt that it was how it was taken, well, I think apologies would be in order. But as far as I'm concerned, I have never had the intention nor the interest to call an entire youth of one nation or another as demons. It was not part of my political repertoire. But having said that, Girma, on elections, Tigray elections, and what will transpire, Rene had come up with an interesting issue. He suggested that it is still possible to find a modus vivendi of sorts between PP-led Ethiopia and PP-led Tigray. Okay? I mean, if Abiy was interested in listening to the interest to the voice of the people, then obviously he should agree to some kind of modus vivendi. But the disposition that Abiy comes from is very strange, because without exercising full control over the 9 regions, he wouldn't feel comfortable. The problem with Abiy is he is strong enough to extend his reach large throughout the country, but he doesn't have that capacity. And Tigray is holding elections because that is the only way we can maintain our legitimacy. That is the only way we can continue to exercise our self-government rights. Normally, this should have been the station of Oromia, the Oromia state as well, the Amara state as well. But for Abiy and company, we have taken full control over the entire country, at least the state houses in Barda, the state houses in Adama, in Pinfine, the state houses in Harar, in Jigjiga, but he doesn't necessarily control the country. The army is now spread throughout the breadth and width of the country, trying to impose a state of emergency throughout the country. And what you see is a situation where the constitution obviously has been absolutely infringed upon by Abiy. Abiy has extended his power indefinitely, and we cannot countenance. In fact, if this was simply about the TPLF's power in Tigray, Abiy has already given us extended in one brush if TPLF's hold in power in Tigray. The Council of Federation, in fact, the CCI came up with a recommendation which was not absolutely called for in the first place. There was no question about national elections in the first place, but they came up with recommendations that TPLF continues to lead, at least in theory, but for the people like Abiy, it is all or nothing. Okay. I hope that Abiy understands that there is this thing for people's interest.
All right. Thank you. Thank you, Mr.
Impose will on others. Well, I can only say that is not going to be a feasible option for him, because it's not about Abiy against Tigray. It is not about.
Thank you, Mr.
This is not about versus Tigray. It is about reaction against the interests of the people.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Getachew. Perhaps if you have a winding up minute comment in a minute or so, Mr. Rene. Mr. Rene, we are winding up our discussion. If you have a final point that you want to make.
I thank Getachew Reda for this discussion. It was very interesting, but I stick to the point which started my intervention, okay? I 100% agree that all the blames cannot be put on the TPLF for what happened in Ethiopia, for the problems who happened in Ethiopia. But I believe that the TPLF has a special responsibility in the fact that the federal system, as it worked during 27 years, was not able to give a sustainable solution to the question of nationalities. And this is the reason why this question raised again in 2015, 2016, through all these youth movements. So, as long as the TPLF will not accept the fact that its hegemonic position in the EPRDF has, or its policy through its hegemonic position in the EPRDF had contributed to sustain the question of nationalities, this age-old problem of Ethiopia. As long as the TPLF will not do that, I think that the TPLF will have many difficulties to be accepted, to be a trustful ally of the other federalist forces.
Thank you, gentlemen.
But I am perhaps completely wrong.
Okay, thank you, gentlemen. Rene from Paris and Mr. Getachew from Mekelle. Thank you for this discussion, and we apologize the sound and video quality on the part of Mr. Getachew. It's the connection problem we are having. So that's all the time we have for this discussion. Thank you again, both of you, for coming on.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
And thank you, our viewers, for watching our program. Have a good time.